I recently ordered something that was delivered on this pallet, and I was planning on discarding it until I realized that one of the pieces was made out of red oak. After taking it apart, which was not easy taking out these rusty nails, I planed the boards and I was able to see that I had some maple, white oak, red oak, and one piece of basswood. Normally, when I start a project, one of the first steps is to go to the lumberyard and pick out my materials, which means I don't work a lot with reclaimed lumber. But there's enough white oak here for a small project, and I want to challenge myself to make a one-of-a-kind piece of fine furniture from this pallet that I can sell. The first thing that came to mind was a stool. I'm starting by roughly cutting out the parts that will make up the legs. I'm doing my best to avoid any knots, cracks, and holes from the nails. After planing these boards, I was left with about half of an inch of thickness, so I need to double up these parts to increase their strength. At the same time, I also glued up some pieces that will be the stretchers. After the glue fully dried the next day, I cleaned up the faces on the joiner and brought them down to their final dimensions on the table saw. I then cut them down to their final length and started marking out some lines for the mortise and tenon joinery. I chopped out one of these mortises by hand off camera, but it took a very long time, so I decided to do the rest of them using the CNC. I didn't take the time to make a file for these, and instead I decided to just jog the machine manually, taking multiple light passes at a time until I achieved the final depth. This worked out very well. The tenons are simple enough to cut on the table saw with the help of a crosscut sled. I then glued the stretchers to the legs, and I got some very nice tight-fitting joinery, which is always satisfying when it goes together. But I did get ahead of myself here, and I should have done something else during this step, but we'll get to that in a second. The legs need another set of mortises to accept the other stretchers, and for these I did make a tool path. I noticed after cutting them though that the walls were left a little rough on the inside, so I ran the operation again and the joint was very smooth afterwards. Again, the tenons for these stretchers were cut on the table saw, and then I added a round over to all the parts. This not only makes them look a lot nicer, but also gives a smooth transition between the flat surfaces, which will help the longevity of the cord wrapping. The roundover bit wasn't able to get into these tight corners, so I used a Shinto rasp to get the rough shape and cleaned it up with some sandpaper. There was a knot in one of the legs that blew out on the router table, and I need to repair this before I continue. My first thought was to fill this void with epoxy, but this is so large on this small project that it'll really stand out, and I don't think it's the right choice for this specific application. So I'm patching it with another piece of white oak. Once that glue dried, I trimmed off the excess, and after rounding it over, it blended in very nicely. I was ready to glue the two leg assemblies together, but I had a feeling that the legs needed more support. I was trying to avoid this to keep the look very simple, but I'm adding lower stretchers to increase the strength and balance out the overall look of the entire stool. These are already going to be tough to put in, so I used simple dowel joinery, which will be more than strong enough. I drilled as straight as possible into the legs and also the ends of the stretchers, and cut some small sections of dowel using my Japanese bull saw, which is perfect for small, delicate tasks like this. These saws are linked in the description if you want to pick one up. I should have glued these in when I did the initial glue up for these leg assemblies. At the time, I didn't think that they were necessary, but I think they're going to add a lot of strength and increase the overall lifespan of this stool. Adding them in now will be a bit difficult, and I can really cause some damage here and make more work for myself if this goes wrong. I added glue into the drilled holes and placed the dowels in one end of the stretcher. I used a scrap piece of wood and a mallet to make sure that that piece was fully seated. After adding dowels into the other holes, I can start the sketchy part. I flipped the head on one of my clamps to turn it into a spreader, and went very slowly and carefully here. To be on the safe side, I added a clamp on the top to hopefully keep the mortise and tenons together. After some time, I was able to line up the dowels with the holes on the end of the stretcher and clamped it tight. Before doing the same to the other leg assembly, I want to add my logo to this stretcher. I used my render optic for this, which is a great tabletop laser. I have another video where I go more in detail on this laser's features, and I'll link it here. If you're thinking about getting a laser, I highly recommend the optic, and there's an affiliate link in the description if you're interested. I then added glue to these holes and repeated the same process to add this stretcher. At this point, I have all the parts cut out for this stool, and I'm ready for the final assembly. This went very smoothly, which is all thanks to the accurate joinery. I added glue in the mortises and clamped everything together. I had a couple ideas on how to attach this long stretcher. I thought about through tenons with wedges, but ultimately decided on through dowels for a couple of reasons. The overall design of the stool is very square, so I thought adding these small circular details will help soften the look. This is another reason I added a roundover to all the parts rather than a chamfer. When rounding over the small stretchers, I purposely left these flat sections near the center, so it's easier to mark out the joinery for the dowels. After the glue dried, I used the Shinto rasp and sandpaper to clean this up. With the main part of the stool assembled, next up is the cord wrapping. And I want to do something different here to make this project more unique. So I'm preparing an indigo vat. I've used this Indigo-Dyed kit in the past, and I really like the results that it gives. It can all be prepared in a 5-gallon bucket, starting with hot water and stirring in the indigo dye. The bottle has some small stones in it to break up any clumps, so I'm putting my finger on the end so that they don't fall in. I added more water to this bottle to make sure I get all of the dye. Then you stir in the lime and iron. You let this sit for 2 hours, stirring it every 30 minutes, and then add the rest of the water to the bucket, making sure to leave room in the top so you don't overflow when soaking your materials. I'll be dyeing this Danish paper cord, but I want to do some tests first so I can try out different soaking times and see if this will even work. This cord is made out of paper and that doesn't mix well with water. I cut some small sections and started the dyeing process, which is quite simple. You start by first soaking the cord in clean water and then soaking it in the indigo. The clean water first helps with the even distribution of the dye. I did multiple soaks at different lengths. I had some great results and then hung this up to dry. I also dyed the bandana that came with the kit and I really liked how that turned out. The next day they were dry and I was surprised to see that the cord wasn't weakened by soaking it in water. So I roughly measured and cut enough cord for this seat and started the dyeing process on that. First soaking it in the blue bucket, which has clean water, and then transferring it into the indigo. The first soak is about 30 seconds and then it's removed and rinsed. It was difficult to thoroughly rinse it in the bucket, so I took it outside, laid it on top of some gravel, and rinsed it with the hose. This next step is very important. It needs to oxidize. Indigo is green at first, and after oxidizing is when it turns blue. There isn't a set amount of time for this, but once all the green is gone, usually within a couple of minutes, you can soak it again. I repeated this process 2 more times, soaking it for 2 minutes each time. There's a couple moths in here because the garage door is open. And there's this one really big one that I think got wet with some indigo because it's blue. It's pretty cool looking. The cord was tangled pretty badly by this point, so it took a while to get this all sorted, but eventually I was able to lay it out to dry. The next morning, it was almost completely dry, so I decided to leave it for one more day just to be on the safe side. Now I can start weaving the seat. I started in one corner, wrapping the cord over itself to hold it in place. I did 5 wraps, making sure to keep it tight. I then added a spring clamp to hold that in tension and repeated the process on the opposite side. Wrapping it 5 times, and the 6th goes across back to the first side. I'm doing 2 strands across and continuing that process for the length of the stool. It was getting pretty tight to weave the spool as I got closer to the end, so I had to unravel the entire thing in order to continue. Rather than finding the end and weaving that through, potentially making some knots, I folded a section and wove that through instead. I did an even over and under pattern and pulled the rest of the cord through. Then I wrapped under the seat and wove the next section in the exact same over and under pattern. That way 2 strands are going in the same direction. The next wrap will alternate, and I was really concentrating to make sure to keep this all consistent. I got to about the midway point when I realized I didn't dye enough cord. I thought about dyeing more, but because it's a natural process, I wasn't sure that the color would match. I really enjoy opportunities like this. It's a great chance to be creative and try something you otherwise might not have thought of. You may have heard the phrase, the difference between a beginner and a professional is that a pro knows how to hide their mistakes. I would take that a step further and say that a professional can turn those mistakes into new opportunities. Situations like this really challenge my skills and make me a better maker. So my solution was to continue the rest of the seat with the undyed cord, which at the end of the day, I really like how this looks. Rather than having a solid blue block, it gives some contrast and some visual appeal in the seat. After doing a bit of weaving with the undyed cord, I decided to add a little bit of the blue and break up the solid white block. I think this was a great design choice and added more asymmetry, which I really enjoy the look of in my projects. I finished the rest of the seat with the undyed cord and tied it off underneath. I added one more cord wrapping to the lower stretcher. This was always part of the design, but I was hoping to do it in blue. I like the undyed cord better for this section, and I think it helps tie the whole look together. This simple project taught me a lot. Making repairs and design choices along the way really test your skills. This tool is available for sale and it's linked in the description if you're interested. Let me know in the comments what you think and if I achieved the task of making a piece of fine furniture from a pallet. Indy seems to think so.